Warning: this episode contains some strong language. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Trunk, reading the stories that didn't make it. I'm Hillary B. Bisnieks. Listeners, I'm so excited on this After NaNoWriMo episode to introduce my guest today. Victor Manibo is the author of The Sleepless, which is coming out in September of 2022 from Erewhon Books. Victor, welcome to the show!
Hey, Hillary. I'm glad to be here.
I was so happy. We're on a Slack together, and I was looking for specifically Nano and post-Nano guests, and you were just like, yeah, I sold my Nano book. You want to talk about that? I was like, hell yeah. So
yeah, no, I am so excited to be here, and I want to talk about the book and that whole experience.
I'm so pumped for us to have that conversation, and I'm so pumped for listeners in the future who you are hearing this right now, because time is fake and the internet is magic. I'm so excited for all of us right now. So Victor, before we get into the Nano stuff, you're going to be reading from the Casket. Is there anything we need to know about that?
Not really. I guess it's one of my trunk short stories, and it's a retelling. I think as we get into it, the listeners are going to know what story I'm retelling.
Fantastic. I'm very excited for this story.
Awesome.
All right. Ready when you are.
The Casket. I have borne thousands of injuries in my long life, and I did so because I knew my place. This is not to say that I've led a life of resignation or defeat. Indeed, the desire to avenge those injuries has never left my heart. But it has always been this amorphous kind of revenge, directed at no one in particular. Not the kind that grew out of some slight or some insult from one of my betters, but the kind that grew out of the notion of having betters at all. But how does one redress that, you ask? Your way might differ, but I found mine a lifetime ago, on the day I met Felisa. When the blockades fell, celebrations rang in the streets for weeks, supplied with goods that started to flood our ports once more. Along with the shipments of wine and stimulants and hybrid meats came the palpable air of freedom. Everyone predicted that de-annexation would soon follow. It didn't, but that's a story for another time. What did follow were our countrymen, who deigned to return after fleeing the country. In fear, they claimed, but those of us left behind knew better. Felisa was one of the returned. She hadn't been to Manila in a quarter century and had long stopped calling this place her home. She found the good life in America, a world away, and whatever guilt she may have had at abandoning her motherland was a sewage when the country was annexed and the blockades went up. That invisible barrier sustained only by the sheer threat of force. She was one of those people, those who seized on the chance to gawk at us as soon as the country was allowed to open up again. For her and her type, the news feeds weren't enough. They had to see with their own eyes. They may look like our people. She and I had the same skin tone, even the same hairstyle. But they were tourists all the same. They came to see the old country, trapped in time. They wanted to marvel at what had incubated here in our years of isolation. And they took a lot of photos. The slums can't be mapped, I told Felisa when she first tried to hire me as her guide. I was barely 16, and she was twice my age. Not to doubt you or anything, she said. But if you all found a way to power the city and get it online, then surely you should have already found a way to map the place, right? Her tone was too clueless to have any malice, and that somehow made it worse. It stung every time someone who should get it didn't get it. It's a cartographer's nightmare. Every couple of days, things get blown up or burned down. Folks move their flatbeds for all sorts of reasons. People build up and out and any which way, even underground. Her eyes glazed over at this. The notion of a sprawl beneath the sprawl hadn't even occurred to her. There are no streets, no house numbers, no stable landmarks. The last network that tried to map the city lost all their drones, netted or zapped, and then scrapped for parts. Despite this, she agreed to my steep fee. Half when we meet, half on the return. The money was nice, but that wasn't why I said yes. The guide business was booming at the time. I agreed because she wasn't like the others. The ones who wanted to buy trinkets or mementos, or worse, the ones who wanted to shoot an authentic video experience in full 4D. She wasn't here to immerse herself in her heritage, as though that could be found in this carcass of a city. No, she wanted to find her mother's tomb. If not for that, I would have walked away. We were supposed to meet at dawn, near the old palace by the river. But as I expected, she came late. The summer heat had done its cooking for the day. The noxious stench rose from the polluted river, and a haze had already enveloped its length on both sides. I gave her the rundown as we approached the riverbank. The trek would take 3 hours, there were no roads, not even for bikes. Not this central in the city, and not for kilometers in any direction. The straight line distance would be quicker, but we had to stay low and close to the ground. She wouldn't have done well on the platforms I traversed anyway, those rooftops that I jumped on. I put on my visor and mask, and gave Felisa a light dome. The quickest route was along the banks, I told her, as I handed her the helmet. And then, only a couple of kilometers more before we head north away from the river. I checked her air levels and tested the comlink. And then, we set out. Nothing's changed, and yet somehow, nothing's the same, she said, as she gawped at the makeshift towers, scaffolds of high-rises built from aluminum siding and shipping containers. Formerly abandoned buildings teemed with extensions that cantilevered out of every floor, forming narrow suspended footbridges. Ramshackle satlink dishes jutted out of corners, power lines crisscrossed overhead and underfoot. Everything's made of metal. That's at least an upgrade from plywood, she remarked. More protection from typhoons. The locals eyed us restlessly. I told her to keep close, even as I assured her in the next breath that she should be safe. This was my domain after all. I didn't know everyone, and that would be impossible, but I knew their type and they knew mine. They knew to steer clear unless they wanted to get sliced. Just the same, I tucked Felisa's ponytail into her dome and zipped up all her pockets. At least the woman had the good sense not to carry a purse. We went down alleys narrower than our own chests, through doors that led to rooms that led to what passed for walkways. She lost her footing a few times, tripping on what used to be a gutter, a curb, a speed bump. Every time she stumbled, hollers echoed from above or below us, and she would freeze in her tracks. I told her to ignore them. I lost my way a few times too, but I never let it on. After all, she paid handsomely for someone who knew the terrain by heart, ever-changing as it was. My visor helped with thermals, and though it scoped out threats, it helped little in guiding the way. I had to rely on memory. Thinking we had cleared the worst of it, Felisa took off the helmet after we turned off from the river. This was a decision she quickly regretted. The stench assaulted her senses with her first breath, and she staggered retching against an old train car. The folks who lived inside it yelled some profanity, banging a fist against their own walls. I yelled back as I helped Felisa to her feet. She took a swig from her hydro pack and put the dome back on. "How did we end up here?" she not asked after a while. "How did we let it get to this point?" "Who's we?" I wanted to say. "It's like toxic black mold," I said instead. Get a place hot and damp enough, close it up, leave it alone for a bit, and it spreads out over the entire surface. I turned to her expecting revulsion, a grimace of some sort, but she only looked deflated. "It's not all bad," I said with unexplained guilt. "The rest of the country's fine. People just moved out to the other islands. You do know this isn't all there is, right?" "Of course I know," she said defensively. She then told me about her childhood in America, how she was raised by an older sister for most of her life. Her father died young, and her mother came back to Manila to take care of her aging grandmother. That was years before the Chinese came, before they took the land, and before they took from the land what they thought was theirs. Annexation followed, then the blockade went up, and her mother got trapped here, along with everybody else who didn't get to flee. Her mother died of an aneurysm. She didn't flinch as she mentioned this, and firmly added that she promised herself she would find her mother's grave as soon as the borders opened up again. It's funny to admit this now, but my eyes welled up when she told me her story. She then asked me about my parents, but I pretended not to hear her. My family history, as you might guess, is nowhere near as cheerful as hers. A crumbling stone arch announced that our search neared its end. North Cemetery. Red raised letters in faded gold paint. Felisa looked confused, likely because the topography hadn't changed. Except for the archway, the landscape was the same. Shacks, posts, beams, held out apartments made of metal boxes, steel slums in all directions, with no indication that we were in the middle of a cemetery. As we moved past the arch, it became clearer to her. This section of the slums were built atop the graves of the dead. Rows of boxy sarcophagi provided the foundation for rickety, multi-family structures. Mausoleums had been converted into scrap metal storefronts or limited seating noodle houses, their neon signs casting a warm glow against the old masonry. In some corners, elevated niches have been hollowed out to house a power generator or an icebox. Some tombs had inexplicably been left alone, but these were rare. "Are we close?" Felisa asked, as she took off her helmet again and had another swig of water. I flipped through the image library on my own visor, and thanked my stars that my digital landmarks were still locked in place. The larger plots were at the far end of the cemetery, I told her. We squeezed through narrower and narrower alleys, navigating through a maze whose walls stretched up to the quickly darkening sky. Soon enough, the roofs of the mausoleums came to view. She could tell that we were close. Felisa took out a vibration gun from her pocket. She held it low and off to her side like a sidearm. Right away, I recognized it for what it was, but those lurking around us thought the worst. Frantic footsteps skittered away in a receding echo. "What the hell is that for?" I asked. "I need to get something from inside. This is to break up the concrete and undo the hinges." "What on God's grey earth are you talking about?" My mother's rosary, she said. The old crone was buried with it. I need to get it. Very little surprised me even then, but this made my stomach turn. Her own mother. I should have known. In the end, they were all the same. The returned, the oppressors. To them, this country is just spoils. My instinct was still right, though. She wasn't like the others. She didn't come here to gawk or to find herself, whatever that meant. She came here to loot. Is it pearls? I asked. Rubies, actually. It's an heirloom, passed down the family for centuries. That is, until my mom decided to keep it for herself. I suppose you'll want a cut, she asked. Now, friend, I tell you, I've done a lot of despicable things in my day, but I was no grave robber. And for her to think of me so low as I now knew her to be. It'll be around this corner, I said somberly. My gaze scanned the ground before us, until it landed on a bottle of wine floating in a swampy gutter among various other flotsam. I maneuvered her in front of me, taking her hand as I guided her through a narrow passage. I surveyed the area with my visor, checking to see how many eyes watched us. The thermals told me they were around, but not looking, not exactly. And even if they were, I was beyond caring. I picked up the wine bottle and hit Felisa in the back of her head. In time, I was able to drag her to the Amontillado family museum. All that I found were empty crypts and sepulchres, hollows where her kinsmen had once been. Stem pod wrappers and broken chem pipes littered the ground. Her family might have been old and distinguished, but now, their final resting place served only as a junkie flophouse. The roof to one of the sepulchres had been removed, and what was left was a low wall about chest high. I peered over and saw a pit about 4 feet down. At the bottom was a casket, its door intact, though broken off the hinges. Clumps of hair and bits of gray rot clung to a tattered lining of yellow silk, but it was otherwise empty. It was here that I lowered her limp body, after I emptied her pockets and bound her limbs with wire. Felisa came to when I replaced the helmet over her head and flipped on the switch. Disoriented, she started to feel around with her hands. But before she could get herself up, I slammed the casket door shut. She pounded against the wooden vault with her hands and feet, begging to be freed. The slow thumps told me she still felt weak from being concussed. "What are you doing?" Her voice crackled through the comlink. "Run your hands through the silk. Do you feel it? Let me out!" "I'm afraid I must leave you here." I turned on the vibration gun, calibrating it with just enough strength to topple over the wall around the pit. I pointed it against the mortar and turned the trigger. A hum came from the chamber, quaking before emitting a low whoomph of concentrated sonic waves. Large chunks of rock crumbled down into the pit. I moved over a few steps to the next section of wall, kneeling down beside it. I aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and fragmented more rock. Where the rubble didn't fall all the way, I kicked it down the hole. Felisa shrieked with each crash, her screams fearful and anguished. She begged and bargained, but nothing she could offer would satisfy me. "Please let me go. People will come looking for me," she said. "Sure, People will come looking. For the love of God. Yes, for the love of God. The pleas ceased coming through the comlink, and the silence made me hesitate. Had she suffocated so soon? But then I heard a whimper, and so I continued on my work. Rise, kneel, wreck. Rise, kneel, wreck. I made my way around the tomb, as in a ritual, ignoring Felisa sniffling as I went. At last I said her name. There came no reply, only a low primal moan. I felt heartsick. But then I recalled her words. How did we end up here? Well, this was how. I flipped off my comlink and held my breath. Then with bare hands and all my might, I pushed down the last standing section of wall.
Whew. Oh my god. That was awesome.
Thank you. That is exactly the reaction that I want. Like a primal whoof.
Yeah. I was like, we were going and I was like, I think I know where we're going with this, I think. And then it hit me all of a sudden and I was like, yeah, buddy.
I'm glad. I really enjoyed, crafting this kind of world and doing a retelling in this world, because I'd never really done retellings before, so I thought, let me play around with this.
Yeah.
Pretty happy with it. A lot of venues were kind of happy. I got some, personal kind rejections, but never quite made the cut.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, it's the nature of the beast, right?
It's the nature of the beast. And yet here we are talking about things that you have sold.
Yes. I would love to talk about that because that's clearly the more exciting one.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate having a very in the place, like knowing the place retelling. Like, I've never been to Manila. I've been off of the North American continent three times in my life. But I felt very much like rooted in the place there, in this, future sometime, but still very much very much connected to history.
Yeah. And I'm so happy to hear that. Like, I was really trying to capture the city where I grew up, and, as with any, colonized nation, country, state, there's a lot of income inequality, there are a lot of slums, and there's also, a lot of, mansions right next to, favelas, to make it more descriptive. We don't call them that in the Philippines, but I think that really conjures up the image of what we also have back home. And so yeah, I think, let me see, let's do a Cask of Amontillado in Manila, but also there's no feast, but there's just this slum that we're gonna have to go through, and not the catacombs, and yeah. So I just tried to have fun with it.
Yeah, it also it reminded me a little bit of Caitlin Starling's The Luminous Dead, just in terms of establishing that just sort of very claustrophobic atmosphere.
Yeah, I've never heard. I haven't read it. I've heard a lot of good things about it. But yeah, that's definitely the vibe.
Super good if you want to get creeped out.
Yeah, I mean, always. If a book is, sold to me as this is creepy, and I'm yeah, I'm there, sold.
Yeah. I also really appreciated, you are an immigrant. I call myself half first generation. My dad emigrated to the U.S. during World War II or right after World War II. My mom's side of the family had been in the U.S. since, the Revolution times. But my dad came from Latvia, so, it's not talked about as being, a history of colonization there, but, the Baltics were, overrun by the Soviets, and is, he talks about he doesn't want to ever go back to Latvia because, I think, I've forgotten her name all of a sudden, but the sense of there's no there anymore.
Yeah. And I think that's very common for, a lot of immigrants to leave, and then they have varying views of their motherland or their fatherland, and some people miss it, some people, don't want to look back.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely wanted to capture that. I also wanted to capture, how, when in that window of time when traveling to Cuba was allowed for U.S. Citizens,
mm-hmm.
how, a lot of people wanted to go check out, Cuba looks so old world because, they had these, blockades and embargoes and,
yep.
not people can't come in. And I thought, that's such an interesting mentality. And,
mm-hmm.
and there are a lot of those kinds of tourists, and I'm not trying to necessarily make a value judgment as to tourism. I think with the story I was trying to say something more about, if you're from this country, if you're from the Philippines, and then you're acting like one of those people who are there for, what is essentially poverty porn, or,
mm-hmm.
finding your heritage. I don't necessarily like that.
Right, yeah.
So I think that's what I was going for. But I thought, that's a really interesting dynamic, or, a really interesting, human desire to see, oh, this place is kind of, it might have been trapped in time. Let's see what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah, there are lots of great reasons to travel to your ancestral lands, to travel to the lands of your forefathers, grandfathers, anything like that. But maybe not for, don't do it for the gram.
Don't do it for the gram, right? And not for the morbid curiosity, and especially for the story. Don't go there just to loot, the family jewels.
Just in general, don't do grave robbing. Even if it's your family grave.
Yeah, as a baseline, never do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So we are through the magic of podcasting. This will be going up around the 20th of December, but we are sitting here talking on the 22nd of November, and we are still in the very midst of NaNoWriMo, and we're talking about a book that you wrote in NaNoWriMo.
Yeah. So The Sleepless is going to be my debut novel. It's coming out June 2022, and I just literally found that out 3 days ago. I
know. I was so excited to see the PW announcement, and I've been retweeting all this stuff since I saw that. It's just yes.
And I'm so happy. I appreciate the support. But The Sleepless, which is to be my debut novel coming out next summer, is a NaNoWriMo book, and it was actually my first NaNoWriMo project ever. This was back in 2017.
Fantastic. We love to see it.
Yeah, it's just had this kind of tortuous journey, but with a fairly happy ending.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of people are going to be listening to this, wondering, okay, I won NaNoWriMo. I got at least my 50,000 words, whether or not I actually finished the book in that prescribed time period. What do I actually do next? So can you talk us a little bit through at least the sort of 30,000 foot overview of how this went from, finished this book in a month, or at least wrote 50,000 words of it in a month, to gonna be on bookshelves?
Yeah, sure. It was kind of surreal finishing NaNoWriMo because I it was a new thing for me. I had never done it before. I've always wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly decided to do it in 2017, like maybe 3 days prior. I'm like, I'm gonna do this. You know what? I had this like story seed that just came to me, and I'm just gonna do it. Let's see if I make it. And I plug away, and some days are bad, some days are good, as
Mm-hmm.
you know, because like
Yeah,
it
we're
it
right
comes
in
in
that.
waves, right? And 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 then I finished, and I was like, wow, I can't believe I did it. When I finished, it was at like I want to say 51,000
Mm-hmm.
words, and the story was kind of complete. And I thought, oh, okay, so I did this for shits and giggles,
Mm-hmm.
basically, and now I have this. Ooh, what do I do next? The like if I can do this, I can do anything, which
Mm-hmm.
was like a really good feeling to have. Um, so I didn't even know that like I had to revise it. I didn't even know that I had to like have other people read it. Like I did, like I said, very little research on what happens next after writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
So so that's what I did. The first thing I did was like, okay, now I have this. What do I do next? I went on Google, like, what do you do after you write? Um, and a lot of advice said, don't send out your NaNoWriMo manuscript to agents. Revise it. And 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 I was like, okay, great, I'm gonna revise it because I also found out right around that time that 50,000 words is like basically nothing if you want a
Mm-hmm.
novel length work. So I did research, and I said to myself, okay, now the next step is revising. I need to revise this. Um, but I also didn't know how to revise. And
Mm-hmm.
there are resources online. There's a lot of resources online, but there's no like kind of network structure community for drafting like NaNoWriMo that you have for revisions, or
Right.
nothing as established. Um, so the next step that I did was, aside from research, is to go to writing workshops, and that's when I learned how to share the work to other people to get feedback and to get notes on how to revise.
Mm-hmm.
It was really like after the thrill of finishing the 50K that I was like, oh, maybe I can do this for serious. And if I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna do this for serious, then yeah, maybe I should invest time and money in going to workshops. And they're not like fancy workshops. They're like, I live in New York, so there are a lot of writing workshops that you can attend, like
Right. Yeah.
after work and all that. So yeah, that's what I did. So that was basically the next step, was like going to workshops and then revising and revising it.
That's awesome. Yeah, it is that feels very familiar in some ways to me. Like, I grew up uh in a household with my parents both being science fiction fans, and like my dad had worked at various magazines in the 80s, and so I had like, I had some ideas of like what you're roughly supposed to do, but I very much like, when I finished my first short story and was like, okay, and now I'm going to sell this. Like,
Right?
it was very much, and this was, I wrote that in 2005, so like the wealth of information that's out here now was like non-existent
Yeah,
comparatively.
yeah. You don't have all
And
these resources online that tell you like, okay, this is how you submit a story. This is how you revise. Like, yeah,
yeah, yeah. So I was reading, like ancient blog posts, and like just kind of like revising things sort of by instinct, and not really like sending things to friends or anything like that, because like I didn't have a network, and there
right.
wasn't like, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Slack, we didn't have all these like amazing resources we have now. Not to say Twitter is always amazing, because Twitter is sometimes a shit show, but
A dumpster fire. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that is, it's really awesome that you had that, like, availability and to be in, I think it's really great in some ways to be in New York and to, like, have just so many resources at your fingertips.
Right, and it was really helpful for me too, because I think as a person, I'm better talking to people face to face and like building friendships and connections face to face. I I was on the NaNoWriMo forums and I was trying to forge friendships there, but it was a little slow going. I know that like if I was in a room with some people, I like vibe with them better, and I would be able to like probably get more a fuller kind of feedback, and also I would learn how to provide feedback and be exposed to other people's works. So I really sought out some like workshops, and that's also how I found my first writing communities, through those workshops. I'm still friends with those folks, and first workshop, I think there were like 3 of us who came in with like excerpts from our NaNoWriMo projects, because that's just how it happens.
Yep. Yeah, that's awesome. I was just thinking back to the first, like, I was in a creative writing program in college, and it was not, it was varying levels of genre unfriendly in general.
I'm sorry.
Which, I sort of, like, made my own way in it, just through, like, sheer stubbornness a lot of the time, and, like, found professors who were more interested in tell a good story, and, like, if it's genre, that's fine, because you're doing the work of telling the story first.
Right, and that's really what's important. Not to rehash one of your recent episodes with Nina about, genre and literary distinctions. When I was in workshops, I had workshops where everybody was doing literary stuff, and I was doing like, science fiction, and I could tell that some folks were giving feedback begrudgingly, and you can, you can sense that, and you try not to like take it against them. But I also got lucky because I did find some workshops that specifically catered to speculative fiction, and that was just like such a whole nother experience. Like everybody got what everybody else was doing, and nobody was like kind of feeling each other out or like looking on, this form or this genre or this category is somehow substandard by the fact that they are that genre or structure or category. And yeah, a good story is a good story, man.
Yeah. And, the people who you meet in, like, if you have a good workshop, I'm still in touch with people from my college class, obviously. I went to a small enough school that, like, I knew basically everybody, at least on site, if not by name. But, like, it wasn't until I took one of Mary Robinette Kowal's classes that I, like, found a community that we haven't... In the last couple of years, like, things went crazy, and we kind of haven't had our regular get-togethers, but for, like, I don't know, 3 years or so before that, we were, like, meeting every week, like, producing new work constantly,
That's so
and,
awesome.
like, being in that space, like, opened new communities to me, and one of my friends from that workshop went to the Viable Paradise workshop, and then I met a bunch of other writing friends through her, and then, was invited to a Slack through that, and invited to another Slack, and, like, got all these Twitter mutuals and all this stuff that just, like, it didn't happen through luck, it happened through, like you were doing, like, putting in the work, and being receptive to the fact that it's a process.
Yeah, and it is a process. It's a long process that involves both craft, right? Because you have to be, but in front of the computer. But there's also the part of it that's the community, getting feedback and knowing, like, how to get feedback and give feedback, and knowing what other people are doing, and kind of almost like bouncing ideas off of each other. I think that's such an important part of the writing process, at least my writing process.
Very same.
I know some folks tend to be like, oh, I'm going to bang this out and not going to tell anyone about it, not going to workshop it, because I don't want the work to wilt in the presence of other people's eyes. And that's fairly valid. That's not how I roll. I needed the community as well. I needed to be able to say, like, hey, what do you think of this? I'm trying to do this. Is this lame? And hopefully you have writing friends, like, good enough to tell you, like, yeah, that's kind of lame.
Yeah. And yeah, I was just thinking, like, this is the second NaNoWriMo this year that I will win, unless like I drop dead right after recording this somehow. Fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But like,
fingers crossed. Yes.
A lot of the
don't die.
If that happens, I don't think anybody's going to hear this episode. So
no. Well, at least we had the conversation. But a lot of the reason that's been like able to happen is that like I've had like 2 separate rubber ducky sessions with Jennifer Mace of just like, okay, I have all these vibes, but I need to turn it into a plot. And then like this weekend we both were at a point where it was like, okay, I wrote myself some very unhelpful notes for what's supposed to happen next. Can we just like talk these things out? And like I definitely, for me, like sometimes I do have to like write in a vacuum, and like I can't write if somebody's looking over my shoulder directly. I know I have friends who stream their writing sessions during Nano, and props to them. Like Valerie Valdez is like couldn't be me. Couldn't
be me. But like being able to, share snippets in Slack or on the forums of like, here's what I did recently, and like thinking about, even back in like my undergrad days, I was doing that on I was on the Brass Goggles forum because that was when steampunk was really big. And I had this like crazy novelette idea that was mostly just like 2 people writing letters back and forth about how smart they were to each other. And no good. Not a good story. But having, like, even though I was sort of, like, writing it in this vacuum of, like, nobody was looking at me, like, I would write a section and then I would post it on the forum and people would be like, this is amazing! I love this so much! And, like, that got me through so much, like, I learned, like, okay, yeah, I can actually write, like, a 10,000-word story.
Yes, and sometimes that's really all you need. Just dump out the words and then make it better later, which is, the whole point of NaNoWriMo. But to go back to what you were saying, like, the cheerleading element, at least to me, is very crucial. I do get through slumps when people see my snippets and say, like, oh, there's something here. Like, this is kind of cool. This is rad. Like, that kind of fuels me. So I definitely feel what you were saying.
Yeah. So, I don't know if it came through on my end, but there was just this weird sound in here, and then a blue police box showed up. And I'm wondering if we can step into this time machine and go back to, October 1st of 2017, and if you, present-day Victor, can have any words of wisdom you'd like to share with past Victor and with anybody who is, trying Nano for the first time, intimidated by Nano, just, like, needs some words of encouragement there.
Oh. Yeah, well, I would tell, past Victor, that NaNoWriMo is for getting words on the page. They're not going to be pretty words.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be brilliant. They're not going to make sense most of the time. They're not going to be grammatically correct. And fuck punctuation, fuck pacing, fuck everything. I can curse on this podcast.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Just get anything and everything you can on the page. An internal editor is horrible in a lot of ways. It works for some people. But for you, past Victor, an internal editor is your worst enemy. So just get the words on the page, and that's what NaNoWriMo is going to allow you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just, put in the work, 4 or 5 hours every night, you'll have something at the end of it. You might not think it's good, but it'll get better. It's a first step, and it's going to be the first step of many that will lead to something great down the line. And I think that's it. Just keep piling on. Like, who said that? Like, this is you putting the sand in the sandbox, right? That's a well-known like aphorism about this whole process of drafting. Just put the sand in the sandbox. Don't worry about anything else.
Yeah, it's like these last 2 years of doing NaNoWriMo for me have like really taught me a lot about my process. And like I wrote a novella that's currently out on sub to small presses.
I'm so excited.
That like I wrote that in 2018, I think, trying to do like a NaNoWriMo-ish push for myself to get it ready for Tor.com was having an open submission period, and I was like, okay, I'm going to get a novella done for this. Totally did not. Like, I finished it before the open submission period opened, but I got one set of feedback on it and looked at it and was like, I don't know what to do with this. And, just sat on it until this summer when I was like, okay, I'm gonna get it. There's a market I really want to target for this. And, like, even if it doesn't sell at that market, which, like, it's publishing. Who knows?
Right.
But it got me through the process of, like, doing substantial edits on a big project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, like, sort of warmed me up for doing NaNoWriMo this year, where, like, it really is just, I know about how much time I'm going to need to write this many words. I am going to sit down, I am going to write, I am going to have people on one screen just cheering me on.
Yes.
And, encouraging each other to do word sprints, and I am not going to worry about how little sense anything makes, because I can underwrite the hell out of this now and fix it in edits.
Yeah, fix it in post. That's what I always tell myself. Like,
yeah.
It's not going to be pretty the first time around. And also I wanted to say, like, I did finish my Nano project that first time. I did 50K, but I know that there are a lot of people who won't get to 50K, and any new word on a page is a victory. Really.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've done NaNoWriMo every year since 2017 because I'm like, hey, you know what? It worked. Let me keep doing that. But I didn't win every year. Like, and this year, I'm not going to win. I know. Right now, I'm not going to win, and that's why I haven't been showing up to the Slacks for the sprints, because I just life got in the way, and sometimes life does get in the way.
That's just what happens.
Like, last year was rough for a lot of people. I know that. Like, November 2020 was.
November 2020 was a time, for sure.
It was. Yeah, enough said. But
there's a reason that my first of 2 episodes last November was just my one cat purring for 10 minutes. Like, that was the level of content I could manage, and that was the level of content I felt like everybody needed.
Seriously, it was a time. It was a time. I did do Nano last year, and you know, and this year I'm doing it again, and I know I'm not gonna win, but like I'm not beating myself up for it. And I guess like that's something I would have told past Victor as well. Like, hey, if you don't win, that's okay. At least you got started on this journey. Because it's new words on a page, new words that you can use and cannibalize for other projects.
Yeah. Like, any words you write are a victory, like you said, and, you know, maybe you don't use them, maybe you figure out halfway through that this just isn't a project that has legs, but, like, figuring out a project doesn't have legs is still an accomplishment. Like, you can't, you know, look at a 2-sentence nebulous idea in your, like, write this someday folder and know that it's not going to work out necessarily without doing it.
Right, and sometimes you need 20,000 words before you realize this is not going to work. Like, before you realize this idea is cool, but this idea is just one scene that I can't expand into a novel or even a short story. And like, this idea should be a screenplay and not a story or a novel, and that's fine.
That's fine. That's great.
Yeah, but you're not going to find that out unless you try it and you put words on the page, and then you read those words and like it's not working. So I guess like let's try this a different way.
So I know we've talked a lot about the Sleepless. Is there anything else that you have coming up that you're excited to tell folks about?
Not really. No other projects. There is a second book after Sleepless. It's not a sequel, but it's also another sci-fi book coming out in 2023. Not sure how much I'm allowed to say about it just yet.
That's fair.
Well, but what I'm excited about in the next few weeks is I'm going to Worldcon. Well, by the time this airs, Worldcon is over.
Yeah.
But I'm excited about Worldcon. It's going to be my first Worldcon, so...
That's awesome.
To see writing friends that I've mostly only met or talked to online, and to see them in real life is so exciting to me. So maybe some of the listeners were there when they hear this. It was nice seeing you at Worldcon.
Shouts to you, listeners.
Exactly.
Well, I'm super excited to know that there is another book coming after this one, and I will be eagerly awaiting updates on that as you can say things. In addition to what you have coming up, is there anything that you've been reading, watching, listening to recently that you're super pumped up about, that you want to hype up for other people?
Okay. This is going to be a controversial pick, but...
I'm here for it.
So I love the original Cowboy Bebop, and now I'm rewatching the Netflix live-action adaptation, and I am digging it. I think I might be in the minority. I know some people have a lot of quibbles, and some people have major issues with it. I'm enjoying the ride. I'm like halfway through the season, and I think one of the main reasons I'm able to do that is because I've been able to compartmentalize, like, this is a different thing that I can appreciate on its own. It's like, you know, I'm just watching another, like, Firefly that looks a lot like Cowboy Bebop, and that's okay, because I love, like, you know, space bounty hunter stories and found family. So, like, this is fun for me. So I'm really digging that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I haven't dug into it yet because I've just been in the nano word mines so deep, and like podcast recording and being on call for my job and like a million billion things. I'm like, okay, in December I'm gonna play a lot of Animal Crossing. I'm gonna watch the new Cowboy Bebop. Yay.
Awesome. The Expanse is also coming up soon, so I don't know if you watch that. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah. Well, Victor, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get going, where can our listeners find you online?
You can find me at Victor Manibo. That's VictorManibo. That's my username on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm also on VictorManibo.com.
Fabulous. Well, listeners, links, as always, will be in the show notes, though depending on how busy I am, it might take me a few days to get those uploaded. Victor, it's been so much fun having you here. An absolute delight, and I can't wait to have you on again.
So much fun. Thank you for having me. I would love to come back on and just jam with you. This was great.
Yeah, I've heard that you have a book coming out in the new year, so, maybe come on the show for a book tour.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to. And, talk about more fun stuff then.
Yeah, I'll have my people talk to your people.
I don't have people. I am the people.
I am also the people.
That is the creative life right there. You're a one-man team.
Yep. Oh. Listeners, stick around next month when our guests will be Jennie Goloboy and Sam J. Miller. I know.
That's awesome. I love Sam. That's amazing.
I love Sam so much. And Jennie's new book that just came out last month, I believe, or earlier this month. Who knows? Time is fake. Just came out from Queen of Swords Press, called Obviously Aliens, is, from all reports, a rollicking good time, and I'm super excited to read it.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah. Tales from the Trunk is mixed and produced in beautiful Oakland, California. Our theme music is Paper Wings by Ryan Boyd. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/trunkcast. All patrons of the show now get a sticker and logo button, along with show outtakes and other content that can't be found anywhere else. You can find the show on Twitter at Trunkcast, and I tweet at HBBisnieks. If you like the show, consider taking a moment to rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform. And remember, don't self-reject.